Tonight's presentation is titled Post-Maintenance Checklist. Our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated and an author for numerous aviation publications, and of course a long-time presenter for our EAA webinar series here. Mike's been doing it just about as long as we've been doing them here. We sure are thankful that he volunteers his time to share his information and knowledge and opinion with us over these vast subjects. Mike holds a certified flight instructor certificate. He's A&P mechanic certificate with inspection authorization, aviation maintenance technician of the year by the FAA in 2008, and a member of EAA. Mike, thanks so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Hi, Tim. Hi, everybody. Tonight's webinar, as Tim said, is titled Post-Maintenance Checklist. Tonight's webinar arose out of a discussion that I had with my Savvy Aviation team. We have about 8,000 or so clients that own piston aircraft that we provide analytical and consulting and maintenance management services for. We have a staff of about 20, 15 of them are A&Ps, 12 of them are real veteran IAs with decades of real world experience working on piston GA aircraft. And recently, one of our clients, whose airplane was just coming out of annual inspection, asked his Savvy account manager what he should look for during pre-flight after he gets on the first flight after he gets his aircraft out of annual. And the account manager decided to pose that question to the rest of our group. We had a vigorous discussion out of which this webinar arises. A lot of owners assume that when the aircraft comes out of maintenance, it's particularly out of an annual inspection, it's been examined by well-trained eyes and it's in perfect condition. But mechanics know better. Mechanics are human and they make mistakes. And it's pretty well established that the first flight after maintenance, particularly heavy maintenance or something like an annual inspection, is by far the most likely time for something to go wrong with the hardware. After all, it's just been partially disassembled, inspected, and then reassembled. And while the reason that we do the inspections is to uncover discrepancies, the process of reassembly is vulnerable to human error, and mechanics are human and they make mistakes. So our discussion kind of started off with the obvious stuff that we want to look for after maintenance. A pre-flight after maintenance should be extraordinarily thorough. Looking for things like loose or missing inspection plates or panels or fairings, attached screws. I don't know how many times we've had clients pick up their airplanes after maintenance, fly the airplane home, and discover that the inspection plate was bent over because it was hanging by one screw, and the mechanics forgot to secure it. And when it got up to 150 miles an hour, it wasn't very happy. That sort of thing is very common. And so it requires an extra thorough look before the first flight. Cowling fasteners latched, nose bowl and spinner screws secured. We have a lot of Cirruses in our the fleet of aircraft that we're responsible for, and the Cirruses have nose bowl screws right up at the front at the air inlets that are very easy to forget to install. And bad things happen when you fly the airplane with those screws not installed. We want to check all flight controls and all engine controls for free and correct movement, and that they move smoothly from stop to stop without any signs of interference or rubbing. I just submitted the manuscript for my column that will appear in the February issue of AOPA Pilot, and it talked about a case of an airplane that came out of annual. It was a Cessna, and a few flights after it came out of annual, the throttle cable got disconnected from the throttle body, and the pilot lost all control over the engine. He managed to land the airplane with the benefit of the mixture control to reduce engine power, but it was kind of scary. And then when I took a look in the NTSB database, I found literally dozens of other cases of the identical situation of throttle cables being reconnected without being properly secured and coming loose in flight. So we need to be real careful about stuff like that. Seats, the seats are all going to have come out of the airplane during inspection, and so we need to check that they're properly mounted to their seat rails and secure. You want to shake the seats and make sure that they're well secured to the seat rails, that the seat stops have been in place. That's another easy thing to forget. As I mentioned, inspect the cowling air inlets. It's a good idea to look in there with a flashlight and look to make sure that all the flexible baffle seals in the engine compartment are oriented in the correct direction, upward or forward, because it's very easy to get those baffle seals in the wrong orientation when you're reinstalling the cowling. And if you do that, it messes up the engine cooling significantly. I don't know how many times we've had cases with where screwdrivers or mag lights were laying on top of an engine because they were forgotten when the aircraft was recowled. So we need to look for all of that kind of stuff on this very, very thorough pre-flight. Check the fuel level, preferably stick the tank, and check the oil level on the dipstick, drain fuel from all sump drains into a clear container, and make sure that there isn't any particulate matter that drains out with the fuel, particularly if the fuel system has been worked on in the course of the maintenance. Do another walk-around inspection looking for any signs of hanger rash, anything that doesn't look quite right. Make sure all of the baggage doors, oil filler doors, anything else that should be closed and latched is closed and latched. There have been any number of accidents, including fatals, caused by baggage doors opening in flight, particularly on twin-engine airplanes where there are baggage doors up on the nose. So we need to make sure that everything is secure. You just can't assume anything when the airplane first comes out of maintenance, because it's been taken apart and it's not in the same state that you left it when you dropped it off for maintenance. Once we've done the world's most thorough pre-flight, we get to start the engine and warm it up, and lots of stuff that we want to be checking. All electrical switches off. The switches could be in any state after maintenance, so we need to start with a clean slate. All pullable circuit breakers in. Very common for maintenance people to pull circuit breakers to disable various things while they're doing maintenance, and we need to make sure that we reset all the circuit breakers. Turn on the battery master. Take a quick sniff and make sure you don't smell anything that smells like it's burning. If you have a voltmeter in the airplane, which is very, very useful to have, check the bus voltage, which should at this point just be battery voltage. Make sure it's what it's supposed to be, 12 or 24 volts. Check the battery ammeter. It should show a small discharge at this point when you first power up the airplane. Then go ahead and start the engine. Verify that oil pressure comes up promptly. If you don't see oil pressure starting to register in 10 or 15 seconds, shut the engine down and call the mechanic. We had a fatal accident that I was involved in a few years ago involving a Cessna 421, where the airplane was in maintenance for quite a long time, and the oil pump of one of the engines got unprimed. And so the engine oil pressure didn't come up. The pilot didn't notice. The engine was damaged, and it came apart about 200 feet in the air, and the fellow was killed. Want to verify that the engine idles smoothly at minimum RPM. With the engine running, we want to turn on the alternator field switch. Check the bus voltage again if you have a voltmeter, and make sure now it's come up to alternator voltage, which is typically around 14 or 28 volts. Check the ammeter. You should see a small to moderate charge. If it's a very high charge rate, if the ammeter is pegged, something's wrong. You may have a stuck starter solenoid or something, but you want to shut the airplane down and investigate. Once you're satisfied that the electrical system is working and the electrical bus has the right voltage on it, you can turn the avionics master on and make sure everything lights up and nothing smells wrong. If you have an engine monitor, it should now be alive, and you want to verify that all of the cylinders, all 4 or 6 cylinders, are making good EGT. That they're all combusting. If you have a cold cylinder, what we call morning sickness, it's usually an indication of a sticking valve, and if all the cylinders aren't combusting at idle, you probably want to shut down the engine and investigate that cylinder. Let the engine idle for a while until you see the oil temperature and CHT start to rise. That'll happen pretty fast if the weather is temperate. It might take a little while if you're up in Oshkosh right now. And then lean the engine to a maximum RPM, which would be best power mixture or leaner. At this point, if everything is looking good, it's time to taxi out and do the run up for this first flight. While taxiing out, there's a bunch of stuff that we can check. Tap the brakes individually to verify that each one of them is working properly and that the pedals don't feel spongy. They feel nice and hard. I like to make some shallow S-turns as I'm taxiing to verify that the nose wheel steering feels good, and that the turn indicator on the turn and slip or turn coordinator, whichever you have, is working properly. Make sure that the attitude indicator has erected properly, and as you're making your little S-turns, you can check the directional gyro or the horizontal situation indicator, whatever you use for gyro stabilized heading, to make sure that the heading is proper and that it's reacting properly as the airplane is deflected to the left or the right while you're taxiing. Once we're in the run-up area, we want to do an extra thorough pre-flight run-up. Again, verify that the brakes hold well at run-up power, that the pedals feel firm. Do a thorough mag check, make sure there's no signs of roughness. It's very common for things like spark plug B-nuts to be forgotten or something like that, which will cause ignition system problems after maintenance. So you want to make sure that you check that and everything is perfect. If you have a controllable pitch prop, you want to cycle it and make sure that you get a prompt response to the prop control, and verify that all the engine gauges, electrical gauges, flight instruments are giving normal indications. Again, flight controls free and correct. There have been quite a few accidents where primary flight control systems were worked on in maintenance and ailerons were hooked up backwards or something like that. And those usually result in very serious accidents. So we want to be very careful about that. Cycle the flaps throughout their range, particularly if they're electric flaps. Check all of the trim controls. In my Cessna 310, I've got 3 of them, and you want to roll all of the trim wheels all the way throughout their range, and make sure that that they move smoothly without any binding, and that if there's a trim indicator, that the trim indicator is indicating normal, then return the trim controls and the flaps to the proper position for takeoff. Once we're satisfied that we've checked everything we can check, it's time for post-maintenance test flight. And the first flight after maintenance has to be considered a test flight. It should be conducted in the vicinity of the airport. In case something goes wrong, you need to be able to put it back down quickly. It should be in good day VFR conditions with no passengers unless your A&P wants to come along. That's always a good thing. And most importantly, it needs to be performed with a test pilot's mindset. It just drives me absolutely crazy when one of our customers has a heavy annual inspection and is informed that the airplane is ready to pick up, and goes down there and loads his spouse and his kids and his dog into the airplane and takes off for the Bahamas or something on the first flight. It's just irresponsible to do that. We need to do a post-maintenance test flight and make sure that everything is good before we carry passengers. On this post-maintenance test flight, as I said, we need to have a test pilot mindset. We have to be prepared for something to go wrong. We have to expect that something will go wrong. On the takeoff particularly, it's important to be spring-loaded to the abort position. If anything looks, sounds, feels, or smells wrong during the takeoff roll, in piston aircraft, we never, ever want to take a problem into the air if we can possibly avoid it. We always want to abort the takeoff if anything seems not quite right. In jets, it's a little bit different. Rejected takeoffs in jets can be kind of dangerous, and often in a jet, the best decision is to take off and make a turn around the pattern, come back and land. But in piston aircraft, we never, ever want to take a problem into the air if we can possibly avoid it. So that first flight after maintenance, you need to be spring-loaded to abort the takeoff. And I've done my share of rejected takeoffs after maintenance for various reasons. It's something that most pilots don't practice very much, but it's very important. On the first flight after an annual or any kind of invasive maintenance like cylinder changes and stuff, you probably want to make a few circuits of the airport before departing the pattern, just to make absolutely sure that you can put the airplane back on the ground quickly if something goes wrong. Stay close by the airport until you have some confidence that everything is okay. During the test flight, there are a bunch of things you want to be checking. Oil pressure, oil temperature, cylinder head temperature. If you have a turbocharged airplane, turbine inlet temperature. Again, the electrical system, amps and volts. Take your hands and feet off the airplane once you get it into cruise and make sure it flies straight and that the rigging is proper. And check out all the avionics, particularly the autopilot, and make sure they all work. One of the most important things about this first flight, and one that I just see owners violate time after time, if you encounter any sort of a problem that you consider significant on this first flight after maintenance, make a 180, go back to the shop, and ask your mechanic to investigate it. There's few things that frustrate mechanics more than owners that fly their airplane home and then call and report a problem when they could have just as easily turned around and let the mechanic rectify the problem on the spot. So that's something that I see our clients violate all the time, and it kind of drives us crazy. It's very important to do a post-maintenance test flight, and if anything is wrong during that flight, it's real important to bring it back to the shop. While we're discussing that, let's talk about timing. Timing is everything. You always want to pick up your airplane during normal business hours, never at night or on a weekend or a holiday when the shop is closed, because again, if there's something wrong, you need to have access to your mechanic to fix it. and you want to pick it up in the morning or early afternoon. So again, if you find a problem during the pre-flight or during that post-maintenance test flight, the mechanic is still available to fix it then and there. And while we're talking about the time to pick up your airplane, don't pick up your airplane on a Friday if you can possibly avoid it. Things tend to get absolutely frantic at maintenance shops on Friday because that's when everybody wants to pick up their airplane because they want it for the weekend. And so maintenance people are under a lot of pressure on Fridays. They're buttoning up airplanes like crazy. They've got a lot of distractions of owners showing up to pick up their airplanes, and it's probably the premier time when mistakes get made, because when you're in a rush and you're getting distracted, that's the prescription for making errors. Most of these errors, like not connecting the throttle cable correctly or leaving inspection plates unsecured, that sort of thing, they're errors of omission. They're things that were forgotten. And so if you can possibly arrange to pick up your airplane in the morning or early afternoon on some day other than Friday, particularly Friday before a holiday weekend, that's a real good idea. Just one more thing that I want to mention before we open it up for questions. When you pick up your airplane after maintenance, never pick it up without getting a signed logbook entry in your hand that approves the aircraft for return to service. In the case of an annual inspection, that states that the aircraft has been inspected and is determined to be in airworthy condition. This is a real trap for aircraft owners. It's very common, disturbingly common, for mechanics to deliver planes to owners and tell them that, especially on Fridays, of course, and tell them that they'll get the paperwork to them, the following week. And that's not acceptable, because it can set you up for an FAR violation. The FARs are a little peculiar in this regard. Part 43, particularly specifically regulations 43.9 and 43.11, require mechanics to prepare and sign logbook entries whenever they perform maintenance on an aircraft, but they don't impose any timeliness requirements for doing so. The mechanic can prepare those logbook entries 3 minutes, 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks, or 3 months after he completes the work, and be perfectly legal. There's no requirement that the paperwork be done in a timely fashion after the work is done. But FAR 91407, which speaks to the aircraft owner and the pilot in command, prohibits flying the aircraft until the logbook entries have been signed off and any other required paperwork like Form 337s and so on have been completed. And it's the responsibility of the aircraft owner to make sure that paperwork is done before the aircraft is flown. So the moral of this story is never accept an IOU for a logbook entry. If the shop gives you back your airplane and doesn't give you a signed logbook entry with it, the airplane doesn't do you any good. You're not allowed to fly it. And this is something we see a lot. And then there's one more little interesting thing for those of you who fly experimentals, EAB aircraft. There's an interesting catch-22 that we've seen, regulatory catch-22 that we've seen come up a couple of times. It's quite disturbing and it really needs to be fixed. But for experimentals, Part 43 explicitly does not apply to experimentals. And so those two regulations in Part 43, 43.9, 43.11, that require mechanics to make and sign logbook entries for anytime they do work, technically doesn't apply to experimentals. But 91407, the thing that says you can't fly the airplane after maintenance without a signed logbook entry approving the aircraft return to service, does apply. And we've seen a couple of cases, fortunately they're rare, of mechanics who have been asked to do annual condition inspections on experimentals. They complete the condition inspection and then refuse to give the owner a signed logbook entry. And they say, well, I don't have to do that because Part 43 doesn't apply to your airplane. And I know of at least 2 owners who have pressed this issue, and it turns out that unfortunately the mechanics are right. They don't have a regulatory obligation to make that logbook entry. Now that's a problem with the regs that ought to be fixed. But in the meantime, if you're an EAB person and you rely on mechanics to do your maintenance, particularly condition inspections, make sure that they've agreed in advance to give you a signed logbook entry, because they're not required to by the regs, but you can't fly the airplane without it. It's, like I say, a catch-22 in the regulations that really needs to be plugged. And with that, Tim, why don't we just open it up for some questions?
Okay, Mike, we got some questions that have come in here. Let's start with John's. Should a post-maintenance test flight be logged in the aircraft logbook? If so, can the owner pilot make the logbook entry?
Well, the answer to that is an interesting one. There is a regulation in Part 91 for something, and I'd have to look it up to give you the exact number, that does require a post-maintenance test flight after any maintenance that can appreciably change the performance or flight characteristics of the airplane. Now, that's a very broad and fuzzy definition. Any maintenance can appreciably change the performance or flight characteristics of the airplane if it's screwed up. And you don't know if it's screwed up before you do the post-maintenance test flight. But at any rate, there are certain kinds of maintenance that are intended to appreciably change the performance or flight characteristics. For example, installing a 300 horsepower engine instead of the 230 horsepower engine, or adding vortex generators or other speed mods or that sort of thing. Those are clearly intended to change the performance and flight characteristics. And after maintenance of that sort, it's very clear that a post-maintenance test flight without passengers must be made and logged. It must be made by some pilot who is qualified to act as pilot in command, and very often that's the aircraft owner, and it must be logged by the pilot. Exactly what maintenance triggers that requirement is very, very fuzzy. But I guess what I'm saying to you is whether or not the post-maintenance test flight is one that triggers the regulation, and the regulation does require that the test flight be logged, you need to consider it to be a test flight, and you need to approach it with a test pilot's mindset. Whether or not you log it depends on whether you feel that it falls under the aegis of that regulation of being maintenance that appreciably affects the performance or flight characteristics of the aircraft. If it does, you're required to log it. If it doesn't, you're not required to log it. But it certainly would not hurt to log the test flight. And so in an abundance of caution, it's not a bad idea to do that.
And Mike's wondering, should we tell ground and tower we are doing a test flight after annual or repair? Sounds like they're at a tower-controlled airport. If you're,
you can sometimes. I usually don't tell the tower unless I'm going to do something unusual. I mean, for example, when I get my airplane on maintenance, if the brake linings have been changed or the brake discs have been changed, I need to do a burn-in of the brakes before I go flying. So I'm going to do basically a high-speed taxi down the runway with some heavy brake applications in order to in order to properly season the new brake pads. And I'm going to tell the tower that I want to do that because he's not expecting it unless I tell him. If you're not doing something unusual like that would cause the tower some grief, I'm not sure that it's necessary to tell the tower. Now that I think of it, I would guess maybe 50% of the time I mention to the tower that I'm on a post-maintenance test flight, particularly if it's a flight where I want to stay in a pattern for a while, or if I want to stay in the immediate vicinity of the aircraft, because I'm based at a towered airport. And so if you're planning to stay in the vicinity of the airport, it probably is a good idea to tell the tower now that I think about it. I think that was a good question. Thank you.
Mm. And Griff's wondering, in light of the EAB Catch-22, can the owner just sign the log after the mechanic has done the work?
Only if the, well, for example, after a condition inspection, no. The condition inspection has to be signed off by the person doing the inspection. And like I say, that this Catch-22 is clearly not what the FAA intended. It's just a peculiar situation with the regulations. But no, if you have a condition inspection done, whoever does the inspection, and it could be the owner if the owner has the appropriate repairman certificate, but whoever does the inspection has to sign off the logbook entry that says that the aircraft is in condition for safe flight. And if it's a mechanic who's doing the condition inspection, then it's the mechanic who needs to sign off that logbook entry for it to have any validity.
Paul asks, so Friday is a bad day for picking up your plane. Do you recommend a day of the week for dropping off your plane for maintenance?
Well, that's a lot easier. Friday afternoon is a perfectly reasonable time to drop off the airplane, even dropping it off over the weekend and putting the keys through the mail slot is okay. I kind of like to give the shop the opportunity to start working on the airplane first thing Monday morning. So there's a lot more flexibility in terms of dropping off the airplane than when you pick it up. But you want to pick it up at a time when the shop is not crazy, and that's the reason that I recommend against picking things up on Fridays, particularly Friday afternoons, because shops just, from many years of experience, shops just tend to be crazy on Fridays.
We've had a few people wondering if you could provide a written checklist, kind of like what you went through here, maybe from your website or something like that would be a good place to get it. So just a suggestion from a couple folks.
Yeah, I've had a few people suggest that, and it does sound like something that I'd like to do at some point when I can get some time to put it together. It's a good idea. Obviously, checklists like this really ought to be customized to the particular aircraft, but I think it would be a worthwhile project to put together a kind of a generic first flight after maintenance checklist, and I will take that as a homework assignment.
And Jim is asking, why don't maintenance shops have someone who performs test flights before releasing the plane back to the owner? Many good auto repair shops do this.
Well, of the hundreds of shops that we work with around the country, there are a small handful that do that, that have qualified pilots on staff, that have insurance that allows them to do that. There's actually a lot of hoops that you have to jump through in order to do that. In my experience, the vast majority of maintenance shops do not do post-maintenance test flights. Frequently, they either don't have pilots on staff, or they don't have insurance that permits them to do those flights and be covered, or both. And so it's at least in my experience, and we work with hundreds of shops around the country, it's the exception rather than the rule. I really think it's a terrific idea, and I very much like the shops that do that, but they are unfortunately few and far between in my experience.
Dennis is wondering, do you recommend removing the cowling for more thorough inspection before the first flight after maintenance?
Well, again, it depends on the aircraft. If you're flying a Beach Bonanza or a Twin Cessna like I have that has big hinged doors on the cowling that allow you to get a pretty good look, it's probably not necessary to remove the cowling. An awful lot of aircraft, you pretty much can't see anything with the cowling in place. And it really wouldn't be a bad idea to arrange to if you can, to show up at the shop before they cowl up the airplane so that you can look things over and just back up the mechanic. This is another thing. If you go to a large turbine repair station or to any aircraft factory or MRO organization, any of the stuff that works on turbine stuff or big iron, you'll see that there's always 2 or 3 sets of eyes on everything. At most big jet repair stations, for example, typically the mechanics work in teams and they check one another's work, and then an inspector comes and takes another look and signs it off. And one of the big problems that we have in Piston GA at the kind of the low end of the aviation food chain where most of us hang out is that frequently there's only one set of eyes that ever looks at the work, and it's the guy doing the work. And that doesn't give you a whole lot of backup. So anything that owners can do to provide that second set of eyes is very worthwhile. And if you can arrange to come by the shop early before they put the cowl on and have a look around before the engine's cowled up, particularly on airplanes where there's not really good pre-flight access once the cowl is on, that would be a really good idea.
Comment here from Gerald. He says, don't laugh, but after maintenance, when I am starting up the airplane after the 100-hour or annual, I have the mechanic or staff stand beside the airplane with a fire extinguisher handy, just in case.
I won't laugh. I know of at least one of our clients that had a pretty serious fire when the airplane was first started up after annual. It was a Cirrus SR-22, and mechanics forgot to reattach some induction port drain lines when they put the airplane back together. And so there was fuel streaming out of those, and there was a pretty bad fire that did some damage. Wasn't really horrible damage, but it got kind of exciting. So I won't laugh at all about that.
Had a number of people asking about owner-assisted annuals. I'll ask David's question here. What is your professional opinion or experience with regard to owner-assisted annuals as it relates to this discussion?
Well, I'm a huge fan of owner-assisted annuals. I think they're absolutely terrific. It sometimes gets hard to find a shop that is willing to allow owner-assisted annuals, but I'm just a really big fan of owners being actively involved in the maintenance of their aircraft. That's actually how I got started in maintenance. I've been an aircraft owner for 50 some odd years and has only been a mechanic for, maybe 30. And I started off as an appliance operator, and I got involved in maintenance, doing owner-assisted annual. And I think it's a terrific idea. And in the context of this particular discussion, an owner-assisted annual is a perfect case where the owner can provide that second set of eyes. You walk around with the IA during the inspection. You do the opening, you do the closing. It's a great opportunity to get a really good look at everything and to provide that backup set of eyes. I also am a big fan of owners that do their own preventive maintenance, oil changes, and so on, where they do decal the airplane and get up close and personal with it, especially on airplanes where it's very hard to get any kind of meaningful pre-flight access to the engine compartment without pulling the cowling. An oil change could be like advanced pre-flight. You get a chance to really look at everything carefully and see whether there's any leaks, any indication of heat distress anywhere, any exhaust leaks, fuel leaks, oil leaks, that sort of thing, anything loose, anything rubbing. So I'm just a big fan of owner-involved maintenance any way you go, and it ties very well into the discussion that we're having now.
Michael is asking, is there any quantified data listing the numbers of safety of flight issues caused by post-maintenance inspection? Or
caused by, I assume, by mechanic error is what the question really is. Mm-hmm. There have been a bunch of studies that have come up with slightly varying numbers, but in general, the studies that I've seen indicate that roughly 10% of all aircraft accidents are caused by mechanic mistakes, and the majority of those mechanic mistakes are errors of omission as opposed to errors of commission, just forgetting to do something that needs to be done. Now, you compare that with 75 to 80% of all aircraft accidents are caused by the pilot. So mechanics cause a lot less accidents than pilots, but 10% of accidents is still a pretty significant number. And I think it's part of the safety equation that doesn't get enough attention. The vast majority of attention in the safety area is on pilots, which it should be, because pilots do cause the majority of the accidents. But I don't think that mechanic errors get enough attention, and I'd like to see more attention given particularly by the FAA to that part of the equation.
Paul's wondering, condition inspection checklist requires a check flight for completion. So legally you can't sign off the logbooks until a flight test is done, but if you can't fly the plane until it's been signed off, catch-22. Well,
Tim, that's probably more your department than mine. I know for certificated aircraft, there is no requirement for a test flight after an annual inspection, unless, as I said, there's a Part 91 reg that says that a test flight without passengers must be made and logged after any maintenance that could appreciably change performance or flight characteristics. That's a Part 91 reg, so clearly the decision is up to the pilot, not the mechanic, and it's a pilot responsibility, not a mechanic responsibility to do that. And of course, the test flight can't be legally made until the mechanic signs off the inspection as airworthy. But it's a Part 91 regulation, not a Part 43 regulation. So it's the pilot's responsibility, typically the aircraft owner's responsibility to have that test flight done if necessary. It's not the mechanic's responsibility, and it doesn't come into logbook entries. If there's something different with regard to experimentals, I'm not aware of it.
John is wondering, do most mechanics use checklists?
Mechanics are required to use a checklist to do an annual or 100-hour inspection. That's written right into the regs. But the regs also say that they can use any checklist they choose. It does not have to be the one from the manufacturer. It can be one of their own devising. It can be a checklist that the owner gives them to use. There's no restriction on what checklist may be used, but there is a regulatory requirement that a checklist be used during 100-hour and annual inspections.
Rob's wondering if there is some post-inspection damage that is clearly attributed to the mechanic, are they responsible for the cost of repairs to get it back to full condition?
Well, generally not. That's not a regulatory question. That's a business question. Generally speaking, with certain exceptions like engine overhauls and stuff, when we hire mechanics, we're hiring them on a time and materials basis. We're paying for their hours of labor. We're paying for the cost of the parts that they replace. We're not paying for a specified result. If a mechanic screws up and causes a problem, that's really, a business dispute that in, serious cases can turn into a civil lawsuit where a jury decides. But it's not a regulatory issue. There's no regulation that says mechanics are responsible for their mistakes. And there's certainly no regulation that says mechanics are in trouble if they miss a discrepancy during an inspection. Mechanics miss discrepancies all the time. We sometimes, when we're doing an annual inspection on an airplane, we find something that's clearly been that way for years and nobody noticed it before. That's why we inspect them every year. We find different stuff every year.
James is wondering, do flight schools that do their own maintenance do a post-maintenance check before turning the aircraft over to a student pilot?
That would be a matter of policy of the flight school. Again, there's no regulatory requirement that a post-maintenance test flight be done, except in the cases, as I indicated, and that applies to everybody, not just flight schools, that after maintenance that may have appreciably changed the performance or flight characteristics of the airplane. There is a regulation in Part 91, so that it speaks to the operator of the aircraft, not the mechanic, that requires a post-maintenance test flight be made and logged and be conducted with required flight crew only, meaning no passengers.
Samir is wondering, are there any continuing education credit requirements for mechanics to maintain their license?
Unfortunately not. That's a great question. I've talked about that before on webinars. It's one of my great beefs with our system. But, I was shocked when I became a mechanic to learn that, as a pilot, we're required to do some things. We're required to take flight reviews every 2 years. We're required, if we're instrument pilots, to take instrument proficiency checks or meet certain experience requirements every 6 months. If we start flying a new type of airplane, often we're required to get a checkout in that airplane. None of that applies to mechanics in the United States. And I say in the United States because it's different in other countries. We have very loose requirements in the U.S. But once somebody gets their mechanic certificate, there is no requirement that they ever take any sort of recurrent training. If you have inspection authorization, if you're an IA, the IA does have to be renewed, and that requires either a certain amount of documented activity, for example, signing off 4 annual inspections a year, or it requires going through recurrent training every year, 8 hours of recurrent training every year, to keep the IA active. For a mechanic who is not an IA, there's no requirement that recurrent training ever be done. And I think that that's a real travesty.
John's wondering, have you ever found a lost tool when doing an annual?
Oh my God. Of course. Of course. We find all sorts of good stuff during annual inspections. Some really nice tools, actually. Some nice snap-on wrenches and 4-cell mag lights and things. Yeah, that's very, very common to have tools sewn up with the patient.
Sewn up with the patient.
Yeah.
Gregory is wondering, he says, Mike, you might want to mention the Waddington effect as for maintenance-induced failures.
Well, the Waddington effect, and that's a long subject, but the Waddington effect, something I wrote about in EAA, Sport Aviation, years ago, probably in 2010 or something like that, is something that says that the more often we do maintenance on aircraft, the more often we take them apart and put them back together, the more squawks occur. And that maintenance, there are really good scientific studies that show the deleterious effect on reliability that maintenance has. It's intended to make the airplane more reliable, but if we do it to excess, it actually makes the airplane less reliable. And in most cases, if we follow manufacturers' recommendations, we're doing too much preventive maintenance and causing more problems than we're curing. And there's a sweet spot that is optimal. And there's a whole discipline called reliability-centered maintenance, and big textbooks written on the subject of how to determine exactly the sweet spot, exactly what the optimum maintenance program is. But in general, for the piston GA airplanes, if we follow manufacturers' recommendations, we're doing way more maintenance on those airplanes than they need, and we're actually causing more problems than we're solving in many cases. And that's what's called the Waddington effect. It's was named after Professor Waddington, who did studies like this for the Royal Air Force back in the early days of World War II. And if you go back in the EAA Sport Aviation archives, you'll find an interesting article that I wrote on that subject. You can probably Google it and find it.
I think you did a webinar on reliability-centered maintenance, too.
I'm sure I've done a couple of them, yes.
Yeah. Frankie writes, on a recent pre-flight of a Cessna 152, straight out of maintenance from my flying club, I noticed that the nav lights weren't functioning. I squawked the aircraft, grounding it, reasoning that it can't be certain what else hasn't been carefully checked. Did I do the right thing, or was I overly cautious? The decision seemed to make me persona non grata.
Well, certainly squawking the nav lights being inoperative was the right thing to do. I don't think that, I don't know what the rules of your flying club are, but normally a pilot doesn't have the authority to ground an aircraft. Usually the maintenance officer of the club or something makes that decision as to whether the aircraft can be flown or not. But certainly the things like that should be squawked. But stuff like that happens all the time. Again, when if you do an annual inspection, you often are taking wingtips off and disconnecting nav lights, and it's just very common that when things go back together, they don't go back together quite right. That's really what this is all about. That's why we have to be so cautious after an aircraft has gone through an inspection or heavy maintenance.
Wally's asking, what do you think about asking the ANPIA to provide you a list of items that were checked? All I ever get is a list of items where work was done and time charged, other than the flat rate for inspection.
Well, as I said, the IA is required to use a checklist, and you could certainly ask him to provide you a copy of his checklist. I don't know that would elucidate all that much, because it's probably a standard checklist that he uses on everything he inspects. But if you really want to do something useful, get the IA to agree to go along with you on that first test flight. That will give him really good motivation. I've said this before, but if I were FAA administrator for a day, one of the rule changes I'd make is that a mechanic who signs off an aircraft is required to go up on the first post-maintenance test flight.
Mm-hmm. Nathan is wondering, with so many modern avionics having multiple firmware or software updates per year, can you discuss how you treat maintenance after those? Maintenance test after those?
I'm probably not the best person to comment on those. Those updates are typically, the responsibility of the owner to get done. Often sometimes they have to be done, by an avionics technician. This is typically not part of the usual annual inspection cycle, because the mechanics typically don't really deal with the software elements, and this is a big transition that we're going through, because airplanes are getting more and more software oriented. But I don't have enough experience with that sort of thing to really be able to comment intelligently, I think.
John is wondering, what is one of the worst pieces of owner maintenance you've found during an annual?
Oh, owner maintenance?
Yeah.
I don't know. Actually, I think owners usually do a pretty good job. I think the worst things I've ever seen are when owners try to do electrical stuff, and they wind up using automotive connectors and stuff that are not really aviation quality, and cause all sorts of problems. Aviation electronics have some pretty stringent requirements on what kind of wire is used, what kind of connectors are used, and I've seen some pretty awful electrical wiring done by owners that really didn't have any business doing that stuff. But that's the only thing that really comes to mind. As a general rule, it seems to me owners are usually pretty careful. They're very motivated to do things right, because they got to go fly the airplane after they're finished with the work.
Robert's wondering, didn't hear this addressed, but technically you don't need maintenance logbook, but maintenance records.
Correct.
Is that correct? And your feelings about that?
Yeah, the word logbook never appears anywhere in regulations. The regulations require maintenance records, and they specify what information has to be contained in the maintenance records, but they don't say anything about the form in which those records are kept. So, if you wanted to keep your records in a computer file, which is kind of what I do, that's fine. If you want to keep them on 3x5 cards, that's fine. If you want to keep them on Post-it notes or on a roll of toilet paper, that would meet the regulations. I don't particularly recommend the Post-it notes or toilet paper, but the point is that the FAA doesn't really care what form your logbooks are in. They just care that the records are kept. It's sort of a tradition to keep engine records separate from the aircraft because of the possibility, which is more likely in fleet operations than it is on owner-flown operations, that an engine might be moved to another aircraft, and so it's convenient to allow its records to move to that other aircraft by being in a separate engine logbook, similar with propellers. In owner-flown operations, we hardly ever do that. We normally don't move engines around from one airplane to another, so it's really less important to segregate the records. It's more of a tradition than anything else, but it's not anything that's written into the regulations. All the regulations do are require that certain records be kept, specify what has to be in those records, and in a reg called 91417, how long those records are required to be maintained. And that's kind of interesting because most of the maintenance records that record maintenance performed, inspections performed, that sort of thing, only have to be kept for a maximum of 1 year from a regulatory standpoint. And from a regulatory standpoint, after a year, you can throw them out. I don't recommend it, especially if you ever want to sell the airplane. But the FAA only requires that most of those records be kept for a maximum of 1 year. Things like airworthiness directive compliance, tracking hours on components that are required to be overhauled at certain times, that sort of thing. Those records have to be kept indefinitely and have to be transferred to the new owner if the aircraft is sold. But the vast majority of the maintenance records we kept from a regulatory standpoint only need to be kept for a maximum of 1 year or until the particular maintenance task is repeated, whichever comes first. We normally want to keep them for a long time because if we go and sell the airplane, the next owner is going to want to see that stuff. But the FAA doesn't require us to keep that stuff for more than a year.
Boyd's wondering, should the logging of the test flight be logged in the airframe log, the engine log, or the pilot's log?
Well, the FAA doesn't say. It doesn't even recognize the existence of logbooks. It just says that a record has to be kept, and you can keep it any place you want.
Rick's wondering, must a mechanic complete any ADs before the plane can leave, or can they be done later at an annual inspection?
Well, that's the answer to that question. It depends on the context. If there is an outstanding AD that is due, it has to be completed for the airplane to be airworthy, but mechanics are not required to determine airworthiness except once a year when we come to them and ask them to do an annual inspection. If we ask a mechanic to, if we bring an airplane in and ask a mechanic to do an oil change and change the right main gear tire and change the left pilot's side window, he's not required to do any kind of an airworthiness determination of the airplane. The only time he has to make an airworthiness determination is when we bring it in for an annual inspection, or if it's in revenue operation, maybe a 100-hour inspection. So if there's an outstanding AD, it's not the mechanic's business, except during an annual inspection. It's the aircraft owner's business. And if you have an outstanding AD that hasn't been complied with and you fly the airplane, the owner could get in trouble for that. But the mechanic's not going to get in trouble for that unless he signs off an annual with an outstanding AD and he signs it off as being airworthy. If there's an outstanding AD during an annual inspection and the owner doesn't want the AD to be complied with, then the mechanic is required to sign off that annual inspection with a discrepancy that says the airplane is airworthy except that AD, whatever it is not complied with. And it's an unairworthy sign off. And then it's up to the owner to get that AD corrected before he flies the airplane. Again, it's not the mechanic's responsibility. It's always the owner's responsibility to get that done.
Randall says, question about A&P currency. I have been told that if an A&P is not active for 6 of the last 24 months, they can no longer exercise the privileges of their license, 6183. Is that right?
That is correct. That is probably the most disregarded and least enforced regulation in all of the FARs. And as far as I know, nobody takes it very seriously unless there's an accident, and the FAA decides that the accident was caused by a mechanic, and they want to throw the book at the mechanic. They're probably going to, ask him to show that he was current. But I've actually never even heard of that happening. It is a regulation. It is a requirement that mechanics have to exercise the privileges of their certificate for 6 months out of the last 24 months to be current. The reg doesn't say anything about how you're supposed to establish that. It's really a regulation that personally I'm not aware of any case where a mechanic has been violated for operating when he wasn't current. It's on the books, but it's not the sort of thing that I've ever really seen enforced.
How would a mechanic show they were current within the 6-month period?
Well, I mean, that's a good question because, for example, mechanics are required to make maintenance record entries, but they're not required to keep copies of them. The maintenance records belong to the aircraft owner. So there's no requirement for mechanics to log anything for themselves. And so that's a really good question. And that's one of the reasons why, again, now if the mechanic is working for a Part 141 repair station, Part 145 repair station, FAA certificated repair station, then there's quite a bit of paperwork requirements. There are work orders and that sort of thing, and there would be a paper trail. But for the typical GA shop, which is not operating as a Part 145 repair station, there aren't any requirements to keep those sorts of records. And so it would be hard for the FAA to prove that a mechanic was operating without proper currency because there's not any requirement for him to keep records of his work. He has to give the owners records of his work, but he's not required to keep records of his work himself. If he's an IA, he will typically keep records of every annual that he signs off because he needs 4 of those a year in order to keep his IA current. Otherwise, he has to go take some refresher training. But other than that, mechanics aren't required to keep anything.
Mark says, Mike, I use a cell phone and snap a photo of my sign-offs. Mark must be an A&P.
Sounds like a good idea. No, I think mechanics are wise to keep copies of maintenance records in case there's ever any question. If there's some kind of a litigation following a crash or something, it would be very helpful for mechanics to have records. And I think most mechanics probably do keep records. It's just the point I was trying to make is that the regs don't require mechanics to keep any records for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Richard's wondering, does a mechanic have the right to withhold the log entry until he is paid for his service?
Well, that's kind of an interesting point. The maintenance records belong to the aircraft owner. And holding maintenance records hostage is kind of tantamount to holding the aircraft hostage. Now, mechanics actually are allowed to hold aircraft hostage under most state laws. They can file a mechanics lien and stuff, but they have to, if they're not paid, but they have to jump through a bunch of paperwork hoops in order to do that. And that's, again, not anything that the FAA deals with. That's a matter of state law, and the different states have different rules for mechanics liens. We've seen some punitive cases of mechanics withholding maintenance records. And so we recommend to our clients that they never give the original maintenance records to anyone, that they provide copies. We scan all the maintenance records in digital form, which is a good idea for lots of reasons, like, for example, if they get lost. And we provide the digital copies to the shops that we work with, because there's no reason that a mechanic ever needs access to the original paper copies. And we recommend to our clients that they keep them locked up in a fireproof safe, and only provide copies to mechanics, to the FAA if the FAA wants copies of the maintenance records after some sort of a mishap. There's no reason that the originals ever have to go anywhere. And we also recommend that all maintenance records be made on self-adhesive stickers, and not directly in the logbook, so that the owner has a chance to review the maintenance records before putting them in their original logbooks. If they don't like the logbook entry, and we've seen a bunch of bad logbook entries made, they can go back to the mechanic and say, I don't like this logbook entry. I want you to redo it, and eliminate this gratuitous verbiage that could have an impact on the value of my airplane or something like that. Or, I mean, we've seen Cessna signed off with for an annual inspection in accordance with the Mooney checklist, because they just made a mistake making the maintenance record. And so we like to see maintenance records on self-adhesive stickers so that they can be reviewed, and if necessary, sent back for a do-over before they become part of the aircraft's permanent original records.
Wally's wondering, can you correct in ink errors on an annual log entry dealing with Hobbs time, date, and number, and other identifying information, or must log entries be redone?
Well, there's no regulation about that, and I'm sure that it would be acceptable for an error to be crossed out and changed and initialed. There is a regulation 4312 that prohibits, let's say, malicious alteration of logbook entries, and the penalties for doing that are very severe. But if it's an honest correction to an error, I don't see any reason that couldn't be done. As I said, with it initialed by the mechanic or something like that. There aren't any regulations that talk about that, so you just have to apply common sense to it. But it is definitely a very bad thing from an FAA standpoint to alter a maintenance record with malicious intent to hide something or to misstate something. That there's serious penalties for doing that. And that is a reg that I've seen enforced lots of times.
Stephen asks, my annual was due September 20th. The AMP finishes it on October 10th. Is the logbook entry annual completed in September or October?
It's completed when the inspection is completed, so probably in October. And so your next annual wouldn't be due until the last day of October the following year.
Peter says, some problems on post-maintenance test flight seem invisible. My gascolator on my Aero was improperly refastened and had a wrong O-ring inserted. 2 days after returning from my annual, all fuel had leaked from my tanks. They were bone dry, and I didn't know why until my home field mechanic tracked the problem down. But I didn't have any easy indication that something was wrong on my post-maintenance test flight.
Well, you're absolutely right. There are some things that we can see and some things that we can't see, and that's one of the problems with the reassembly problem. I've written articles about the nature of mechanic errors, and most errors are made during reassembly, and some of those errors are difficult or impossible to find during post-maintenance inspection because the reassembly process covers them up. An incorrect O-ring is a perfect example. Once you put the thing together that has the O-ring in it, you can't see the O-ring anymore. And so if the O-ring is wrong or twisted or broken or something, you probably won't be able to catch it on inspection. What you should have probably caught is the puddle of fuel under the airplane. And it's interesting that it wasn't caught until the tanks were dry. That's a lot of fuel to lose. But obviously, one of the things that we do want to do after any maintenance involving the engine, particularly, or the fuel system, is a leak check, because that's a very common kind of an issue.
Donald's wondering why, when an engine is rebuilt, do you start a new engine logbook? It's still the same engine.
It's not the same engine. When an engine is overhauled, it's the same engine, and you don't start a new logbook. When an engine is rebuilt is a very specific regulatory term defined in FAR 43.2. An engine can only be rebuilt by the original manufacturer. An engine shop cannot rebuild an engine. It can only overhaul an engine. And when the factory rebuilds an engine, it is a new engine. It has a new serial number. It has a new data plate. It's not a new, I don't mean that literally. It's not new. It is it's an engine that's never existed before. And it has a serial number that has never existed before. It does not inherit the data plate of the engine that you trade in. The engine you trade in gets disassembled into a zillion parts. A lot of those parts get thrown into a recycle bin for going off to scrap metal dealer. Other parts like crankcases and crankshafts go through refurbishment and wind up in somebody else's rebuilt engine at some point in the future. And your rebuilt engine gets made up of a bunch of parts that came from other people's engines, plus a whole bunch of new parts, and it gets a new data plate and a new serial number. So a rebuilt engine, which can only be done by the factory, is an engine that has never existed before. And that's why it starts with a zero-time logbook, an empty logbook, because it's an engine that has just come into existence as far as the FAA is concerned. An overhauled engine is your original engine, and it has parts from your original engine plus a whole bunch of new parts, and it retains the original data plate, and it has the same serial number, and you keep the same logbook and continue the time with that says 0 hours since major overhaul, but however many hours since new, because it is the same engine that you sent in is the same engine you get back from a legal standpoint. It has the same data plate, same serial number, and it's considered the same engine. I hope that made it clear.
Yes.
Rebuilt and overhaul is different, very different.
Well, Mike, looks like we bumped up against the end here. Please take a moment and share closing comments. We sure did have a great turnout tonight. I think we were bumping 800 people that were logged in tonight. So that's wonderful.
Great. Boy, the last several of these have been very well attended, and I'm very gratified to see that. I'll just remind everybody the usual stuff. If you're not on my monthly e-newsletter list, you can put yourself on the list by going to savvyaviation.com and clicking the put your email address in there and clicking the button. If you stick around for the post webinar survey that Tim is going to put up after I stop talking, there's a checkbox that you can check to put yourself on the list for my monthly e-newsletter. My 2 books are available at Amazon, and I'm working on the 3rd one, which I'm kind of hoping might be ready by next AirVenture. And just a quick note on the next 3 webinars. The January webinar will be talking about annuals and the whole process of what you are approving when you put your airplane in for annual and what you're not approving, and how the dialogue between the owner and the shop should go. In the February webinar, we're going to be talking about breaking in cylinders. And in the March webinar, which I've entitled An IA's Dilemma, I'm going to talk about a couple of interesting cases where IAs have done an annual inspection on an airplane, and what they see in the logbooks and what the owner tells them is different, and how the IA is expected to resolve those sorts of discrepancies. There are a couple of interesting stories that have rather different endings, so I'll be talking about that stuff in the March webinar. And that's all I have, Tim. Thanks everybody for showing up. It's great to have a nice turnout like this.
Hey, thank you so much, Mike. Great presentation. Really appreciate you sharing it with us. And to everybody who tuned in tonight, thank you all so much for logging in. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.